two men stood over the wreckage of the Republic and looked at each other across the Mediterranean world. Mark Antony was everything a Roman general was supposed to be. Physically imposing, charismatic, beloved by his soldiers, a fighter of genuine courage and considerable tactical ability. He had served Caesar loyally for years, had delivered the eulogy that destroyed the conspirators' political position, and had spent the years since Philippi governing the eastern half of the Roman world from Alexandria with a competence that his enemies preferred not to acknowledge. He was 40 years old, experienced, and backed by the wealth of the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean. Gaius Octavius Caesar, who had by now acquired the honorific Augustus, meaning the revered one, though that came slightly later, was none of those things. He was 23 when the civil wars ended at Philippi. He was physically unimpressive, frequently ill, prone to mysterious ailments that kept him from the battlefield at inconvenient moments. He was not a natural soldier. He was not particularly charismatic in the way Antony was charismatic. He didn't fill a room with energy and warmth and the sense that being near him was something special. What he was the coldest and most precise political mind of his generation, possibly of any generation. He understood, in a way that Caesar had not quite grasped in time, that Romans could accept autocracy if it didn't look like autocracy, that the Senate could be managed rather than dismissed, that the forms of the Republic, the titles, the elections, the debates, could be preserved as theater while the substance of power rested entirely in one pair of hands, that what Romans needed, after a century of civil war and violence and instability, was not a king. They needed someone who could make things feel normal again. He would give them normal, he would give them peace, and in exchange, quietly, incrementally, without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened, he would take everything. But first, the war with Antony had to be finished. The relationship between the two men had been managed for years through the Second Triumvirate, a formal, legally recognized power-sharing arrangement between Octavian, Antony, and a third man named Lepidus, who was gradually sidelined and forgotten, which is what happens to third members of triumvirates. Octavian held the West, Antony held the East. The arrangement was sealed, as these things were in Rome. With a marriage, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman of reportedly impeccable character and genuine political intelligence, and proceeded to treat her with a casual contempt that gave Octavian exactly the propaganda he needed. Because Antony was in Alexandria, and in Alexandria there was Cleopatra. Their relationship had begun years earlier, during Caesar's time in Egypt. After Caesar's death, Antony had summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus. Summoned her, as a subordinate power is summoned by a superior one. She arrived on a golden barge with purple sails, surrounded by attendants dressed as sea nymphs, herself dressed as Aphrodite, trailing perfume across the water. It was a performance of extraordinary deliberate brilliance, and it worked. Antony never quite recovered his political footing in the relationship. They were lovers, allies, and co-rulers of a vision of the Eastern Mediterranean that had no place in it for Octavian, or the Senate, or Rome's traditional notions of how the world should be organized. Antony gave Roman-controlled territories to Cleopatra and her children as gifts, territories that were not his to give. He celebrated a triumph in Alexandria rather than Rome, which was constitutionally irregular and symbolically catastrophic. He named Cleopatra's son by Caesar, Caesarion, the legitimate son of the divine Julius, which was a direct challenge to Octavian's status as Caesar's heir. Octavian responded with the most effective weapon available to him: information. He had Antony's will, which had been deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome in accordance with custom. He seized it illegally and read it aloud in the Senate. Whether it was genuine, altered, or entirely fabricated is a question nobody has ever been able to definitively answer. What it said was that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra, rather than in Rome. The Senate voted to strip Antony of his powers and declare war, not on Antony, because that would be another civil war and Romans were exhausted by civil wars, but on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen who had seduced a Roman general away from his Roman wife and his Roman loyalties and his Roman destiny. It was a masterpiece of framing. They met at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, in 31 BC. A naval battle that was less a clash of evenly matched forces than a collapse. Cleopatra's fleet broke and fled for reasons that ancient sources argue about still. Whether it was a prearranged signal, a failure of nerve, a tactical decision that made sense in a larger strategic context that was already lost. Antony followed her. His fleet surrendered. His land army, abandoned by its commander, held out for a week and then gave up. Octavian pursued them to Egypt. Antony made one last attempt at resistance, got a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, and fell on his sword. He didn't die immediately. He lingered long enough to be carried to wherever Cleopatra was hiding and to die in her arms according to the sources, which may or may not be true, but is certainly the kind of ending the story demanded. Cleopatra outlasted him by a few days. She met with Octavian, assessed him, understood that he intended to take her to Rome as a trophy for his triumph, the foreign queen displayed in chains before the Roman crowd, and decided against it. The exact method of her suicide is uncertain. The asp, the Egyptian cobra, is the traditional story, and it appeared almost immediately in Roman accounts, which suggests either that it was true or that it was too symbolically perfect for anyone to want to question it. The Queen of Egypt, dying by the bite of the royal serpent, on her own terms, in her own palace, denying her conqueror his prize. She was 39 years old. Octavian killed Caesarion, the only potential rival with an actual blood claim to Caesar's legacy, and absorbed Egypt into the Roman Empire as his personal property, not a province administered by the Senate. His, the wealthiest territory in the Mediterranean, generating agricultural surpluses that could feed Rome, and tax revenues that could fund armies, belonging personally to one man. He returned to Rome in 29 BC and celebrated 3 consecutive triumphs. Then, he set about the most delicate political operation in Roman history. He gave power back, or appeared to. In a series of carefully staged scenes in the Senate, in 27 BC, Octavian announced that the emergency was over, the civil wars were finished, and he was restoring the Republic. He would resign his extraordinary powers. He would return to being a normal citizen. The Senate, which understood perfectly well what was actually happening, responded by begging him to stay, by voting him the title Augustus, the revered, the consecrated, set apart from ordinary men, by granting him command of all the provinces that had armies, which was most of them, and all the provinces that were strategically sensitive or recently conquered, or not yet fully pacified, which covered almost everything else. The Senate kept the quiet, stable, long-settled provinces. Augustus kept the legions. He also held tribunician power, the power of a tribune of the plebs, sacrosanct and inviolable, permanently. An imperium proconsulare, the military authority of a senior magistrate over the entire empire, permanently, and the title princeps, first citizen, which was technically just an honorific but carried enormous traditional weight. He was not king. He was not dictator. He had no single title that summed up what he was. He was simply a man who held simultaneously more powers than anyone had ever held before, justified by accumulated grants from a grateful Senate rather than by any single act of usurpation. It was brilliant. It was also completely irreversible. He ruled for 44 years. What he built in that time was the Principate, the system of government that would run the Roman Empire for the next 3 centuries. He reformed the army, creating permanent professional legions with standardized pay, terms of service, and retirement benefits. Loyal to him personally, and stationed at the frontiers where they could defend the empire without threatening its center. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force stationed in and around Rome, the only soldiers allowed in the city, whose loyalty to the emperor was the last line of defense against any challenge to his power. He reformed the tax system, the provincial administration, the judiciary, the grain supply. He built roads, aqueducts, forums, temples. He famously said he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He also found Rome an empire of chaos and left it something that functioned. The period of relative peace that followed, interrupted by wars on the frontiers, by the catastrophic loss of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, when a Germanic chieftain named Arminius ambushed a Roman column and destroyed it so completely that Augustus reportedly wandered his palace at night, crying out for his general Varus to give him back his legions, was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It would last, in various forms, for the better part of 2 centuries. Augustus managed succession with less skill than he managed everything else, largely because he kept outliving the men he chose as heirs. His nephew Marcellus died young. His generals Agrippa and Drusus died young. He adopted his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus. And Drusus died young too, leaving Tiberius as the only option. His daughter Julia, his only biological child, he used as a political instrument, marrying her 3 times for dynastic reasons, and she repaid him by conducting affairs so flagrantly public that Augustus was eventually forced to exile her for immorality. In a move that Romans found darkly comic, given that his entire political program had included a major public campaign promoting family values. He died in 14 AD, at the age of 75, at a town called Nola in southern Italy, having outlived almost everyone he had ever known. His last words, addressed to the friends gathered at his bedside, were reportedly, "Have I played my part in the comedy of life well enough? Then applaud as I exit." The Senate voted him divine status. Temples were built, priests were appointed, and Tiberius, dour and unloved and fully aware that he was nobody's first choice, became the second emperor of Rome and began the long, strange story of what happens when one man's genius creates a system that ordinary men have to run. The answer, it turned out, was complicated.